Now remember, one thing that I want you to remember is that bones are organs. How many tissues do you have to be for something to be considered an organ? How many? At least 2. Okay, so name one tissue in your bone. It's like the easiest one. Bone. Bone is the tissue, okay? So we got bone tissue inside our bones. What else? I heard you, Morgan. Nervous tissue, right? You break a bone, can you feel it? Heck yeah, you can. So you got nervous tissue. What else do you have in your bone? Blood. So right there, we've got bone, nervous tissue, blood. We have connective tissue, right? Remember this periosteum on the outside? That's connective tissue. We've got all different kinds of tissues in our bones. So it is considered an organ. Now, what you're looking at in lab this week is you are going to look at a disarticulated skeleton. So you will be looking at those, you'll pull out those black boxes and you'll pull out the bones that are not articulated. You'll have to be able to identify when you pull out a bone, like, oh, this is the femur, or this is the humerus, this is the radius. So you should be able to identify it when you're just looking at it, but you are more importantly identifying what are called bone markings. A bone marking is a bulge, a depression, or a hole on that bone. So you might look at a bone marking and it might be a projection. So it's something that's kind of sticking up on the bone. If it's a projection, it is there for one of 2 reasons. One reason is this is where big, heavy muscles are attaching to the bone, and you're going to have a projection there. So a good example might be, I don't know if you can all see those now. On the femur back here, there is this giant projection right here that kind of sticks up on the back of it. This projection is here because you have gluteal muscles that connect right here to the bone. So every time that gluteal muscle contracts and you lift your leg to the back, it is pulling right here on the bone. And it's causing the bone to grow away from itself right here, and you're getting this projection, okay? The other reason why you can have a projection is because that's where you're forming a joint. You can look at the femur again. You can see at the very end of the femur is this big projection. It's a big ball at the end. This is forming a joint right here. So projections are there because you've got a big muscle attaching or you're forming a joint. The other kind of bone marking you'll see are holes and grooves. These are going to be there because you have to have something being able to pass through the bone at that hole. So for example, a hole might be present because you've got to be able to pass blood vessels or nerves through the bone. So you're going to be looking at the skull on Wednesday, and you can see there are a lot of holes in the skull, right? These are allowing blood vessels and nerves to pass up to the brain and back down, okay? So holes are there to allow things to pass through the bone. Projections are there because you've got big muscles or you're forming a joint. So there are some very general bone marking terms that are in your textbook. And it might be helpful if you look at those before Wednesday. Like for example, one of the terms in this table in your book is a foramen. Very general, it just means hole. But if you see a structure and it is called, let's say for example, the vertebral foramen, you know you're looking for a hole because it has the word foramen. You might see the name in this table, something called a tubercle. Tubercle is a big projection. It's very, very not specific, very general. But you know that if you see something with the name tubercle in it, you're looking for a big projection. Okay? So the table is kind of helpful. before that lab on Wednesday. Now I'm going to walk you through the structure of bone. Bone has two layers to it. Has this dense outer layer called compact bone. And then it has this layer called spongy bone. We can also call it cancellous bone. So again, you looked at this model last week where it looks like tree rings up in here. This is all compact bone. It's very compact. Spongy bone would be like at the end here, where you have all these holes in it. Okay? So those are the two different kinds of bone that we have. So I'm going to walk you through the structure of all the long bones in the body. So long bones, remember, they always have a shaft, which is called a diaphysis. In the diaphysis, there is a medullary cavity. There is a space inside the diaphysis. And in an adult, it is filled with yellow bone marrow. So there are a couple of reasons why your bones are hollow and why you have this medullary cavity. One is it is a place to put our red bone marrow and our yellow bone marrow. But the other is it makes your skeleton lighter, makes it easier to lug around. So if we look at this image of a long bone, I want you to look at the picture on the left, okay, and you can see that medullary cavity, which runs in the middle of that diaphysis. And in this case, it's filled with that yellow bone marrow. The epiphyses are just the expanded ends of a long bone. They are covered with what's called articular cartilage. Remember, an articulation is a joint. So if we look at the epiphyses, which is up here and down here, it's just the end of that bone gets fatter and bigger where it forms a joint. And remember, it's wrapped in articular cartilage. Remember, this is the kind of cartilage we find so that the bones don't wear down on each other. There is also in the epiphyses something called the epiphyseal line. This is another term for this, is the growth plate. This is truly where your long bones are going to grow in length from. It's from this epiphyseal line. It separates the epiphyses from the diaphysis. So if we look, you can see that epiphyseal line right there. Now there are some membranes in our long bones. There's a periosteum and an endosteum. You know we're talking about bone because of this part here. Osteo is bone. And then if we look at the prefix, peri means around the outside, and endo means inside. So we know, if we just look at these terms, we know the periosteum goes around the outside of the bone. We know the endosteum goes around the inside of the bone, those internal cavities, like the medullary cavity. So let's talk about the periosteum. The periosteum contains blood vessels and nerve fibers and lymphatic vessels. And it is secured to the bone by those Sharpie fibers. So it's really tough. It sits on the outside of the bone, and it is also making sure that nutrients and blood vessels, it's making sure that nerves, all of that can get into the bone. Now, periosteum is going to have little holes in it called nutrient foramina. These are little holes that just allow the blood vessels and the nerves to pass into the bone. So I want to take a minute and talk about that term, foramina, because I mentioned a couple minutes ago this term, foramen. Foramen is a hole, okay? To make that term plural, it becomes foramina. The same thing. Foramen is one hole, foramina is many holes. Okay? It's just the plural form. So it should make sense. We call these nutrient foramina because they're letting all the nutrients and blood vessels and lymphatic vessels into the bone. The endosteum is the membrane that covers the internal structures of your bone. So it lines the medullary cavity. It covers all of that spongy bone inside. So if we look at this picture, now we're going to come over here and look at the image on the right. We can see the periosteum around the outside, and we can see where it's connected by all these Sharpie fibers to the bone. And then we can also see these nutrient foramina. So you can see these holes here that are allowing the nutrients to get into the bone. You can also see the endosteum, which is going to line the inside of the bone, like the medullary cavity. So that's the structure of a long bone. So you guys in lab looked at a beef bone, a frozen beef bone, to look at the structure of a long bone. But we also have other types of bones. We have short bones, thin, flat bones, and irregular bones. So what does the structure of those look like? Well, it's going to be really different from a long bone, because a flat bone and a short bone, they're not going to have a diaphysis. They're not going to have an epiphysis. So they look different. So the structure of short, flat, and irregular bones is they are more like thin plates of bones. They remind me of sandwiches, where the bread of your sandwich would be compact bone, and the inner part of your sandwich is spongy bone. So they look more like a sandwich. Okay, so if we look at this picture, this is looking at a flat bone, it's a skull bone. If you look on top, you can see this plate of compact bone here and here, like the bread of your sandwich. And then in the middle is that spongy bone. Now the spongy bone, remember, is still going to be covered with that endosteum. There's obviously no epiphyses, no diaphysis. And there is going to be bone marrow within the spongy bone. Where we find bone marrow in our spongy bone is in the holes. And the holes in your spongy bone are separated by something called trabeculae. I'm going to star this because students always forget this. So if we go to this image, the image on the bottom is looking at spongy bone. The trabeculae is where you actually have the bone. Okay, so like trabeculae are here and here and here. To me, the trabeculae would be sort of like if you built a bridge and you put pillars to hold the bridge up, the pillars are like the trabeculae, right? So you're going to find red bone marrow in all the holes of the spongy bone, and we say that it would be found between all the trabeculae. This is an important term, trabeculae, because as we talk about bone remodeling and how your body can change your bones, one thing that your body will do based on the force that you put on your bone is in your spongy bone. Let's say you're using your bones a lot. In your spongy bone, your body can start laying down more trabeculae and making the bone harder and stronger. It would be like if you had a bridge and you started putting in more pillars to that bridge to just give it a little more support. So you can do that in your spongy bone. You can add more trabeculae if you need more support. Now, I've mentioned this a little bit already. Where we find red bone marrow in an infant is going to be pretty much every hollow opening and space inside of your bone. So in the medullary cavity of our long bones and in all the spongy bone everywhere. In an adult, where are we going to find red bone marrow? We're going to find it in our spongy bone, which is pretty much the epiphyses of our long bones, and in flat bones, right? In that space of our flat bones. So in an adult, where we usually will find our red bone marrow is going to be the epiphyses of the humerus. Up here, we call this the proximal epiphyses. We'll find it in the proximal epiphyses of the femur. We'll also find it in the flat bone here of the pelvis. This is actually, if somebody has to have their bone marrow tested or withdrawn, this is the place they're gonna do it because your hip bone is really close to the surface as it's easier to get to than you can imagine than the epiphyses of your femur or your humerus. So this is where they might withdraw bone marrow if they have to do that. Remember, all of your blood cells are formed in red bone marrow, not yellow bone marrow, but red bone marrow. Okay. In an adult, we don't need as much red bone marrow because we are not growing as much. We are just maintaining our blood cell concentration. So we've gone through the structure of long bones, short, flat, and regular bones, kind of talked about what they look like. We're going to drill deeper and look at the microscopic structure of bone. Now, in your bone, you actually have 4 different types of cells. You have a type of cell called an osteogenic stem cell. And these are stem cells. So remember that term stem cell. These are cells that don't know what they're going to be when they grow up yet. An osteogenic stem cell can be any kind of bone cell, right? It has osteo in the name. So these can become any of the other 3 types of bone cells, okay? These cannot become neurons, they cannot become muscle cells, only types of bone cells. So what are the 3 types of bone cells? We have osteoblasts. I remember the B in blast for the B in build. These are the bone cells that are, sometimes we call them immature bone cells. Their job is to build the bone. They make bone. We have osteocytes. Think of the term cyte, just means cell. These are just mature bone cells. So we've talked a little bit about these 2 already. Remember, in our bone, we have osteocytes in lacuna. So remember, it's a tough tissue. Cartilage and bone, the cells are found in lacuna. So what's the difference between these 2? An osteoblast, it is making bone. So how I imagine this would be like you have a cell that is literally secreting the bony matrix all around itself. It is making bone, and it just keeps on going until eventually it has basically made bone everywhere around itself, and now it is stuck in a hole. And at that point, we say it's an osteocyte in a lacuna, right? So while it's making the bone, it's an osteoblast. And then once it's mopped itself into a corner and it's stuck, now it's an osteocyte, okay? The other kind of cell is an osteoclast. Osteoclasts destroy bone. So I remember C, D. So I just remember the alphabet, A, B, C, D. Clasps, destroy. Okay, so why would we ever need to build our bone? When are we building bone?
In the womb.
Okay, you're making it for the first time. Okay, so you're building it in the womb. Okay, what else?
When you break your bone.
When you break your bone, so you have to repair it. You've got to fix it. Okay, when else? My 9-year-old's about this tall. I don't think will be this tall when he's 20. So as he's growing, he is making more bone, right? So building bone, this makes sense. When do you ever destroy your bone? Why would you ever destroy your bone? I talked about it earlier in the lecture today, and it has to do with calcium. Why would you ever destroy your bone?
If you're not getting enough, you need to use it for the bones.
If you do not have enough calcium, we need it for everything. How we get it is we destroy our bones. So you destroy your bone to get calcium from your bone. Okay? So we have these different kinds of cells based on what our body needs. We can build bone or we can destroy our bone. Okay? These are all of the microscopic structures that we find in our bone. These are the same things that you guys looked at in lab in this model, okay? So we're going to talk about some of these structures. So the osteon is the structural unit of your bone. So if we look at this picture, you can see what we've done is we've taken a long bone and they've taken just a little chunk out of that long bone and blown it up really big right in the middle. And you can see an osteon right here. So this is one, they've kind of pulled it out, but you can see another one here. These are the tree rings, like the whole thing. The individual rings are called lamella. These are the weight-bearing tubes. They have a lot of collagen in them. Remember, collagen is really, really tough. So for example, you can see a ring here and another one here, and this is another lamella. And you can see all the rings within that osteon. So those are lamella. The central canal, sometimes we call it the Haversian canal. I always call it the central canal. It's just easy to remember. This is the hole in the middle of the osteon that contains blood vessels and nerve fibers. So you can see a central canal in the middle of every one of these osteons. So that shows you how very vascular your bone is. Now a Volkmann's canals run in the opposite direction and carry the blood vessels into the deepest part of your bone. So the Volkmann's canals you can see are like here and here. So they're carrying the blood into the bone. Osteocytes are our bone cells. And again, remember they're found in lacuna. And then canaliculi, these are gonna connect one lamella to the next. So these are, if we look at this image down at the bottom, this is looking at a little portion of an osteon. And you can see the canaliculi are the little grooves that you find in the lamella. And they just help to get the blood supply all the way to the outermost lamella, the outermost ring. So from the central canal, all the way out to that outermost lamella. So we've gone from looking at bone, so the gross anatomy of long, short, flat, and regular, to the microscopic anatomy, so what you need a microscope to see. Now we're going to dig even deeper and talk about the chemical composition of bone. So what is your bone chemically made of? I'm going to star this slide because you're going to see a question on this on your exam. I'm probably going to ask you a bonus question about this as well. So chemically, your bone is classified as an organic portion and an inorganic portion. The organic portion of your bone is called osteoid. This is basically a matrix that is ground substance and fibers. That's it. It's an extracellular matrix, ground substance and fibers. It is giving the bone a structure and some strength, right? Because collagen fibers are strong. The inorganic part of your bone is called hydroxyapatite. And hydroxyapatite is basically calcium. It's the mineral salts, so the calcium salt. So the organic stuff is basically the extracellular matrix without the calcium in it. The hydroxyapatite is the calcium salt. So this is what's going to make your bone hard. And it makes up, this hydroxyapatite makes up 65% of your bone by mass, mostly calcium phosphate. And obviously calcium makes your bone hard. So it is responsible for your bone's hardness and resistance to compression. Children have much less hydroxyapatite in their bones than adults do. So like my son, he plays hockey. And he'll be on the ice, or even if he's outside, like on his rollerblades, and he will take a fall that I will gasp, and it will stop my heart when I watch it. Or he'll get checked into the boards, and it takes my breath away. And he literally jumps up and he's like, I'm good. And he keeps going. And I'm thinking to myself, if that happened to me, if I took that kind of fall or somebody checked me into the boards like that, I would have like a broken shoulder or a broken hip. There would be something broken in my body. Little kids, typically, when they break their bones, if they break, they don't break all the way through because their bones are way more flexible because they have way less calcium in their bones when they're little. So their bones have a lot more give to them. Okay? Children have a lot less hydroxyapatite than adults.